Hey everyone, Sam Pearson here. I worked as a games designer in the Warhammer Design Studio for the last 7 years, where I worked on wargames such as Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar. I also led the design of other wargames such as Warcry. This video is the first in my game design theory series, where instead of looking at the design and mechanics of just a single game, we're going to look at a broader design topic and see how its application can differ across a variety of tabletop games. In this video, we're going to look at activation systems, specifically in tabletop war games. It's a topic that's going to be fun to explore, but it can also be controversial from time to time, especially when it comes to what activation system should be used for Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar, and that's something we'll discuss later in this video. So this topic is an interesting one if you're a budding games designer or just a player of tabletop games, and I think that the line between the two is not that distinct. Inside every player of tabletop games is a budding designer, so even if you're just curious about how to improve the games that you already play, rather than necessarily designing your own games, this is going to be a fun topic to explore. I'll see you after the jump. An activation system sits at the core of every wargame as its beating heart. It defines the sequence of play by dictating when and how players take turns and what players get to do on their turn. Now, currently the discourse is dominated by two activation systems: I Go You Go, seen in games such as Warhammer 40,000, and alternate activation, which you can find in games such as Bolt Action, or to use another Games Workshop example, Kill Team. As for me, I have designed under both systems. I did Age of Sigmar Spearhead, which is I Go You Go because it uses the Age of Sigmar core rules, and I also led the design of Warcry, which uses alternate activation. We'll define how each of those work in just a second, and we'll also pitch the two against each other to decide which one is best. But those are far from the only activation systems out there, so we'll also explore the wider gaming landscape to see what other activation systems there are, and we'll cook up a few of our own as well. Okay, let's look at the two most commonly employed activation systems: I Go You Go and alternate activations. The names for each, I Go You Go and alternate activations, may seem like misnomers at first. After all, unless you're playing Hungry Hippos, few tabletop games let you act simultaneously. But the names actually stem from how the sequence of play unfolds over the rounds of a game. For example, in Warhammer 40,000, a battle is comprised of 5 rounds, and in each round, each player takes a single turn, in which they activate all of their units. In a player's turn, all their units get to move, shoot, and fight, and so on, and then play is passed over to their opponent, who does the same, before the round closes and the sequence resets. In other words, every round, I take a turn and then you take a turn. I go, you go. On the other hand, in a game like Kill Team, over the course of a round, players instead take many turns. This is because on each of their turns, instead of activating all their units, they instead activate just one. And instead of there being a set number of turns in a round, there are as many turns as there are units on the battlefield. Play goes back and forth between the players, each taking turns to activate a unit one at a time until there are no more units left to be activated, at which point the round closes and the sequence resets. This is alternate activations. Like any mechanic in games design, both systems come with pros and cons, but not just that. Each brings a unique feel and a different pace to your game. And these are two things, the game's feel and the game's pace, that I'm going to be bringing up a lot in this video, so I wanted to call them out early. The feel of I Go You Go is what I would call strategic, while the feel of alternate activation is tactical. By that I mean I Go You Go is a system where players can hatch plans on a grand scale, executing big battlefield maneuvers, mass cavalry charges, flank attacks, routing the enemy line, and so on. And its pace is therefore one of ebb and flow. During a player's turn, they are on the attack and have the advantage. Their opponent needs to hunker down and hope their defensive measures are enough to weather the onslaught before they can mount a counterattack of their own. Alternate activation, on the other hand, is about minute-to-minute action. Rather than viewing the battlefield at a grand scale, you are instead down in the trenches with the troops. It has a much quicker pace, where every action made by one player invites a reaction by their opponent. A tank rumbles forth down a street, time to redirect your anti-armor weaponry. A squad of infantry make a dash across open ground, time to redirect your artillery fire upon them. The different feel of each of the games defines its pace, and it is the biggest strength of each of the systems. But they also come with their own inherent weaknesses. Let's look at I Go You Go first. So while the pace of I Go You Go is this big ebb and flow where players take turns on a grand scale, and this helps define the feel of the game, it is a double-edged sword, and it is also the root of most criticisms against it. The first of these criticisms relates to an idea I introduced in my Spearhead video, and that is one of feedback loops. This is the idea that when you destroy a chunk of your opponent's army, they then have less units with which to retaliate, meaning they are less likely to destroy the same amount of your units in return. And this situation begins to loop back round on itself into something called a positive feedback loop, or as gamers might call it, a death spiral. Now this feedback loop exists in all wargames. It is just the nature of a game where you destroy your opponent's units. But I Go You Go exacerbates this feedback loop because players activate their units en masse, and this means it is much easier to deal a killing blow before the opponent has a chance to react. This is especially painful if it happens on the first turn, where it is called an alpha strike. The second issue of I Go You Go is something called the wombo combo. This phrase describes a player doing a series of coordinated moves which, if pulled off correctly, can lead to an instant victory, or at least an unwinnable situation for their opponent. You can think of this like a card game. Magic the Gathering is full of wombo combos, and many decks are built around this strategy. All you need to do is assemble the right pieces and then pull the trigger. You can see the same thing occur in Warhammer 40,000 from time to time. If the right combination of units, auras, stratagems, and buffs can create an unkillable combination. And wombo combos, even if they require skill to pull off, they leave a sour taste in the mouth of the opponent, which is why generally they're considered to be bad games design. The last criticism of I Go You Go may seem trivial at first, but I think it's one of the biggest, and that is the longer it takes for a player's turn to complete, the longer their opponent stands around with nothing to do. We're talking about war games after all, so this speaks directly of that game aspect. Players want to play the game, and the longer you deny a player from making any meaningful impact in the game, the more likely they are to switch off and become disinterested. So those are the biggest weaknesses of I Go You Go, and they can all be boiled down into two things essentially. When you get to activate with all of your units at once, turns can be A, too long, and turns can be B, too impactful. And one thing I don't see brought up explicitly in the debate, but I think is crucial, is this idea of turns being too long and too impactful is especially important in the first turn of the game. During the first player's first turn, their opponent has not even begun to play yet. And so if the first turn is too long and too impactful, these issues are going to be much more keenly felt than at any other point in the game. No one likes to be on the receiving end of an alpha strike. And it's not just about losing the game in the first turn. Even just being put on a significant back foot before you've had a chance to make any meaningful decision can leave a sour taste in your mouth. Now, one of the things I find interesting about the differences between I Go You Go and alternate activation is that in alternate activation, the length of a turn stays roughly the same throughout the course of the game, but in I Go You Go, it fluctuates from round to round. In alternate activation, each turn is to activate a single unit, so a turn will always take roughly the same amount of time. As units become destroyed, it just means less turns are taken overall rather than those turns becoming shorter. The pace of the back and forth between the players stays consistent. I Go You Go, on the other hand, because all of a player's units are activated at once, the fewer the units on the battlefield, the quicker the turn becomes. If you were to map out the length and impact of a turn in a game such as Warhammer 40,000, I think it would look something like this, with the longest and most impactful turns at the start of the battle. In fact, this steady decline might not be quite right. At its worst, it can look something more akin to this. I think we've all experienced games that have played out like this. Here we have two incredibly crunchy and impactful rounds right at the start, in which most of the action takes place. And once the dust settles, well, there's just a few quick turns left to play out in often what is already a decided game. I don't think for even the most ardent fans of I Go You Go, this is the overall pacing they want to see. It's all piled up towards the start of the game, and most importantly, turn one is too impactful. I think if we were to map out the ideal turn pacing for a 5-round I Go You Go wargame, we would want something that looks closer to this. Here the action rises. The first turns are quick to play through, meaning both players get stuck into the action relatively quickly, and it builds builds up to a pivotal center point in the game on round 3. And there are some I Go You Go wargames that follow this pacing. At its best, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, or the Old World, has this pacing, and it manages to accomplish this despite the first turn being the time when the most units are on the battlefield. And the way it achieves this is by limiting the impact of the units on turn 1. A first turn in classic Warhammer or the Old World can be completed relatively quickly. Regiments push forward, jockeying into position, a few spells are cast, a cannon shot is fired, and then it's over to the other player's turn. This means both players get stuck into actually playing, making decisions and rolling dice relatively quickly. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I think of particular importance is how long does it take for both players to have had at least one turn. So despite there being lots of units on the battlefield, the length of the turn is kept minimal by reducing the impact of units in those earlier turns. Units are simply not yet in range. They're not in range to charge, missile troops need to wait for the enemy to move into firing range, and things like cannons are curtailed in list building. I think over time, games like Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar have had their pacing stray from this to what we see today, something that looks more akin to this. And there have been a number of different factors that have contributed to this, from smaller battlefield sizes to increased movement rates and maneuverability, less impactful cover rules, and of course, larger army sizes in general. This has all added up over the years and can mean at its worst, these games open with a first turn that's like a high noon shootout, and whoever is faster on the draw comes out on top. And I think that's why there's been this growing criticism of I Go You Go, especially in recent years. Of course, there is another way to solve these pacing issues, and that is to use a different activation system, such as alternate activations. But alternate activation also comes with its own set of problems and its own inherent weaknesses. And the biggest of these is the problem of lopsided activations. That is, what do you do when one side has significantly more units to activate than the other? Well, you could just let it run its course, and that's what I did with Warcry, but that's not a path that I would recommend. Warcry has a lot of good things going for it, but the issues around lopsided warbands is a very valid criticism of its design and probably one of its biggest weaknesses. In Warcry, when sides are mismatched, the more numerous warband can bait out all of the actions of the smaller warband by activating inconsequential fighters to begin with. Once the smaller force is out of activations, the player controlling the more numerous side then takes all of their remaining actions uninterrupted. Essentially, they get a big turn at the end, which kind of boils the game back down into I Go You Go, but with all of the advantages just favouring one player. They can direct fighters onto needed objectives or dogpile an enemy fighter without fear of getting attacked back. So this is the biggest issue with alternate activations, but it's far from an insurmountable problem. There are many games that use alternate activations and have a design mechanic within them to navigate this issue. They tackle this problem in many creative ways, and the solution you pick is going to give your game's alternate activation a different flavour to the rest. One example is the approach taken by bolt action. Here, both players put a number of dice into a shared bag equal to the number of units on the battlefield, and each turn a dice is drawn at random. If it is one of your dice, you activate one of your units. This adds an unpredictability to the game. Sometimes a player will get to activate a few units in sequence, other times there will be this back and forth, but the unknown element adds excitement and surprise. Another solution is the simple one like kill teams. Here, once one side has fully activated, they can activate any of their fighters a second time, but when they do so, they only make a single action, be it a dash for cover or a desperate shot. I really like this approach because it makes your heroic fighters generally behave more heroically on the battlefield. When given the chance to activate a fighter a second time, it's probably going to be your leader to get them stuck in combat, or your fighter with a heavy weapon. It can also give some rubber banding to the game, helping the player on the back foot with fewer fighters by giving them a chance to act again. So both systems come with a different feel. I Go You Go with its grand strategy and alternate activations with its nail-biting tactics. Both two come with their own inherent problems. The pacing of I Go You Go can create death spirals, it can allow unsatisfying wombo combos, and also it can just bore the opponent who has to stand around waiting for their turn. Alternate activations, on the other hand, can start to fall apart if there's a big difference on the amount of units each player has on their side. So as a games designer, when you're designing a war game, you need to take both the strengths of these systems and the weaknesses into account when deciding which one is right for your game. But while both offer a different feel and both have their own strengths and weaknesses, I think it would be a little boring of me just to sit on the fence. I promised you guys a throwdown, so which do I think is the better system of the two? For me, the pacing issues of I Go You Go are too much of a detriment. There are ways to mitigate them, sure, as discussed above, but it is a very fine balancing act, And even if you do pull it off, I Go You Go has such a bad rep among many gamers now that many will simply check out as soon as they hear that's what a game is using. So if I were to design a wargame from scratch, I would almost always use alternate activation as my starting point. I think in their purest forms it is the better system, which is why it is so ubiquitous with skirmish wargames that you see today. I would only consider I Go You Go if the strategic feel is of paramount importance. Say for example, the game you're designing is one about commanding a Roman legion or a Napoleonic army, and you want the player to be executing grand battlefield maneuvers that alternate activation cannot offer. But even in those cases, I would consider a hybrid system between the two. And that brings me on to the next part in this video. What other activation systems are out there? One way I like to think of I Go You Go and alternate activation is as either end of a spectrum. On the one side is I Go You Go, where you activate all your units on your turn, and this gives the game a strategic feel. On the other side, alternate activations, where you activate just a single unit and the game has a more tactical feel. There's this whole space in the middle, and that space is filled with many unique systems that offer a middle ground between the two. They help to avoid the pitfalls of pure I Go You Go while retaining a bit of its strategic feel. Here are some other activation systems of note. The first activation system is one I'm going to call unreliable activations. You see this in games such as Lion and Dragon Rampant and in War Master. Here the activation system is I Go You Go, but there's a twist. How many units you'll actually be able to activate on your turn is an unknown factor. Both of these games have you make an activation roll each time you activate a unit, and you can keep activating units from your army until you fail a certain number of rolls. What I like about systems such as these is it keeps that ebb and flow. One player is on the attack, the other is on the defense, but it makes for much quicker turns overall. It also gives an unpredictable nature to the game, and that won't appeal to everyone, but it does appeal to someone like me, and I think it emulates the chaotic reality of medieval warfare. Over on the other side of the spectrum, you could look at a game like Star Wars Legion. Star Wars Legion builds upon the bolt action style alternate activations with elements that incorporate a more strategic feel. Based on your commander leading your force, say Darth Vader or Princess Leia, you'll have a hand of command cards, and at the start of each round, each player plays a card from their hand. Every card has both an effect and an orders section, and the latter of these elements, the orders section, indicates which unit can be given order tokens. Once the round begins, play alternates between the players back and forth as standard for alternate activation. On a player's turn, they can either activate one of their units that has an order token or draw a token from their bag. Players do not have a shared bag like in bolt action. Instead, they each have their own bag, and each token randomly drawn corresponds to a different type of unit, say a core unit or a heavy unit. This means that when you draw a random token, you do not know exactly which type of unit from your army you'll be able to activate, whereas the units with order tokens can be activated exactly when needed. This means you're able to exert some control on when your most crucial units will activate, but in doing so you also flag your intentions for the round to your opponent, and altogether this adds this great strategic layer to the game. Another system you commonly see in larger battle games such as Epic Armageddon, Legions Imperialis, and the last iteration of Warhammer 40,000 Apocalypse is one of alternating detachments. Here, instead of activating all or one of your units, you instead activate a contingent, say a quarter of your army at a time. This is a great way of striking the perfect midpoint between I Go You Go and alternate activations. And these systems usually add extra layers such as issuing orders to each contingent at the start of the round to determine in what order they can activate. What's great about systems like this is at the start of every round it feels very strategic, especially in those systems where you can choose an order or something like that for your contingents. But then as the round plays out and you get to see what your opponent is doing, you start to change your plans, you start to react to what they're doing, and so it takes on this nuance of tactics towards the end of each round as well. The last system I want to draw attention to is the one featured in the Middle-earth strategy battle game. Rather than trying to seek a midpoint between I Go You Go and alternate activation, this system instead takes the phase structure of a typical Warhammer game and flips it on its head. Instead of the different phases such as moving and shooting happening inside a player's turn, the turns instead happen inside each phase. In other words, it's not I go, you go, but I move, you move. I shoot, you shoot, and so on. This means there is this constant back and forth between the players, but players can also still execute these big and satisfying strategic maneuvers, such as the heroic charge of the Rohirrim. Alright, so we've looked at lots of different activation systems now, and we've compared the two big ones, Aigo Yugo and alternate activation. And while I've said that both of them have their own weaknesses, for me the pacing issues of Aigo Yugo make it the worst system out of the two. So with all that being said, I think people will be curious on my thoughts as to why a game like Warhammer 40,000 or Age of Sigmar hasn't adopted a system like alternate activations. So that's what I want to talk about in the next part of this video. A quick caveat, I don't speak for the studio in any regard. I haven't worked at Games Workshop for about 6 months. What I'm about to tell you just relates to the 7 years that I worked there. And while I might not be able to give an answer that satisfies everyone, I'm going to try my best. So nowadays, when releasing new games, especially new skirmish games, the studio tends to favour alternate activations. We've seen that with Kill Team, Warcry, Underworld and Necromunda. But not just the skirmish games too. Games like Legion Imperialis and the last edition of Apocalypse, they favoured alternating detachments over Aigo Yugo. So why don't the flagship games move over to a similar system? Well, straight away you can make a case for the feel of the game. And I would say there are many who want the feel of the game to be strategic. And I think this is because both games evolved from Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Even if 40k is science fiction, it's also a universe where knights with swords and shields make heroic charges. But this sort of argument is very subjective in my opinion. Sure, there might be many people that want the game to have a strategic feel, but there could be equally as many people that want the game to have a tactical feel. So I won't dwell on this point so much. Instead, let's push forward and think, what would moving over to alternate activation be like for the games? Well, firstly, I think the diverse nature of armies in 40k and Age of Sigmar presents a big design challenge when thinking about how the game might work in alternate activations. Now, as said, this is not an insurmountable problem, and many implementations of alternate activation have approached this issue with creative and fun solutions, but there are few, if any, of those games that have as diverse a roster as the big Warhammer games. In these games, armies can have as few as 4 or 5 units to their side, see Imperial Knights or Mega Gargants. On the other hand, you have armies where the battlefield is flooded with cheap chaff, as in a green tide list. And as an example, I'm not sure if Bolt Action's dice in a bag system would be that exciting to play through if one player has 5 times as many dice in the bag as the other. Furthermore, no matter which of the solutions you go for lopsided forces, they all bring with them their own inherent problems too. One criticism levelled at Bolt Action's dice system is that it can lead to something called list padding, where the cheapest units are added to a list just to get another dice in the bag. If this system was added to 40k, would we usher in a new meta of the battlefield being flooded with cheap foot heroes hiding at the back behind some ruins just to guarantee an early activation of an important unit each round? Another thing standing in the way of introducing alternate activations is for all the people clamouring to bring in a system like this. The data says that Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar have never been as big as they are right now, and that's by a considerable margin. The games have grown massively over the past 10 years. They have never been as popular as they are right now, and tournament attendance is at an all-time high as well. That means there are many people out there enjoying the game as it currently is, and a big shake-up like this could cause them to lose the game that they love. An example I would give is 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, a system that brought with it many modern game design trends at the time that seemed like a good idea, and it was a very well polished system, but its stark difference to what had come before ended up fracturing the player base, alienating a big portion of it until the game returned closer to its roots again with 5th edition. However, that's not to say the numbers are the be-all and end-all of the argument. It can be frustrating to have your arguments hit this brick wall of numbers and data. And the obvious riposte is, despite the game's current popularity, couldn't they be even more popular if it adopted a better system like alternate activations? For some, it may seem like the studio is stubbornly sticking to Aigo Yugo on its flagship games, or that the designers are oblivious to other systems and they're not even being considered. But my experience is that couldn't be further from the truth. The Warhammer Design Studio represents a cross-section of the wider gaming community. Walking around, you'll see things like someone's Infinity project on their desk next to their latest Warhammer 40,000 project. Or you'll hear people in the tea room getting excited by Trench Crusade. Almost any miniature game out there, there are fans of that game inside the studio, and after work I've seen a variety of games being played, anything from A Song of Ice and Fire through to Spectre Operations. So whenever the studio is working on a new game, or it's working on a new edition of one of the flagship games, lots of ideas from other games are brought forward and discussed. They are talked about, they're looked at, they're drafted up, and that includes activation systems as well. And when the studio is designing games from the ground up, it tends to favour other activation systems, like the alternate activation systems used in skirmish games or the alternate detachments used in mass battle games. But for the flagship games, there's always been this worry that it's too much of a shake-up. So rather than risk alienating existing players, the decision has always been made to try and remedy the problems of I go, you go instead. And that's the reason why things like the reactive command abilities were introduced into 4th edition Age of Sigmar. The idea is, on your opponent's turn, you get to do something in every phase, and the thing that you get to do is what your opponent was just doing. So at the end of their movement phase, you get a chance to move. At the end of their shooting phase, you get a chance to shoot, and so on. However, I think it's perfectly fine to be of the opinion that these changes don't go far enough, especially when the problems of I go, you go are being exacerbated by other changes made to the flagship games, such as the smaller battlefield sizes, the larger armies, and the increased maneuverability and firepower. So if I was to work on either game again, I would want to explore a midway point between the two. A system similar to the one found in the last edition of Apocalypse, one of alternating detachments as outlined before. Here you could imagine a 2,000 point army being split into 4 contingents or 4 detachments of around 500 points each. And straight away you can see how this normalizes the amount of activations each side has. It doesn't matter if your army is made up of 5 or 6 Imperial Knights, or if it's made of tons and tons of Orcs and Gretchen. Each of you gets 4 activations over the course of the round. On the surface of things, this seems to offer a nice middle ground between the two systems and helps mitigate some of the biggest problems of I go, you go. Namely, it would make the downtime between the turns much shorter, especially the wait for the first turn. It would also mitigate alpha strikes or just punishing positive feedback loops in general, while at the same time still allowing players to enact strategies and maneuver multiple units at a time, just limited within a single detachment rather than across their entire army. Another reason I would want to try this out is I think it opens up some interesting design space in other areas. One thought I have had about Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar for quite a while now is that deployment just takes far too long. It was actually one of my observations when I used to be a judge at tournaments in Warhammer World. A lot of players, if they overran during the round, and there were 3-hour rounds for the games, if players overran, it was because they simply spent too long setting up their armies in deployment. So with a system like this, it would also open up the potential for not starting with all of your detachments on the battlefield at the start of the game. You could start the battle with just a single detachment on the battlefield, and then as the rounds progress, bring in a second, a third, and a fourth detachment at the start of each subsequent round. What this would do is it would help with the overall pacing of the game. It would introduce that rising action that I talked about, help bringing the game to a pivotal center point rather than having all of the action take place in the first and second turns. This makes me think of another type of game that I love, and that is card games, specifically Magic the Gathering. Yep, I know, I roasted Magic the Gathering just a few moments ago for the wombo combos, but despite the wombo combos, it's still a game that I love. A game of Magic, like 40k, can have these really complex board states, but the big difference is the game doesn't start like that. The board state is incredibly simple to begin with, and it slowly builds up into a more complex board state. This is accomplished by limiting land cards to being played once per turn. As lands are what you use to gain mana to cast any other sort of card, the first turns play out very quickly. Indeed, the first turn is often less than 10 seconds as a player plays their land and then passes. Using a detachment system like this in a wargame to stagger deployment would help give you that same pacing and complexity scaling. The battlefield would start off very simple, with the equivalent of 2 combat patrols facing off against each other. The first turns would be very quick to play through, and from there the complexity would begin to rise. So I think there's something to this idea of alternate detachments that is worth considering and worth exploring inside the flagship games. But this leads me on to my final point, which is This is all theory. It's very easy for me to sit in my office and talk into the camera like I'm some big know-it-all that has all of the answers. But with any games design idea or mechanic, you can't really know how it's going to pan out until you put it into practice. It's fine to come up with new theories and ideas. Indeed, that's the first step in games design, no matter what you're doing. But the next step is to put the theory to the test by building a prototype. And this is a topic I will save for a longer video, but what I want to stress is that a lot of ideas sound good in theory, but one needs to get them on the tabletop to identify the problems and think of the solutions. Off the top of my head, how would units that are bigger than 500 points, say Archaon or Nagash, work in a system? I don't know. That's something that we would need to figure out. In my last video, I introduced a Jervis Johnson maxim, which was the shorter rule is the better rule. Well, another one he instilled in me was games design is an iterative process. Very few ideas start out great. You need to keep building upon them, discovering their issues. I would say being a good game designer is not about having ideas. Ideas are a dime a dozen. It is about executing well upon those ideas, and that is something that takes a lot of hard work and iteration. Alright, I think that's all I want to say on the subject of alternate activations inside the flagship games Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar. Yes, I think it could be very, very interesting if done right. But remember, I am not speaking for the studio. I no longer work in the Warhammer Design Studio, and who knows what the future might hold. But overall, I hope that was a well-reasoned argument and it satisfied you, at least on some level. Okay, for the final section of the video before we wrap up, I thought it might be fun to explore what other sorts of activation systems are out there that could be used inside wargames. Really, I think the sky's the limit when it comes to new activation systems. There are always new ones that we could come up with. Giving your game its own unique activation system is certainly a risk, but it's one with a big payoff. What I mean by that is when you come up with a new activation system, if it's one that doesn't resonate with players, then it might put them off entirely. On the other hand, it can become the signature of your game. It can become the thing that attracts people to it and makes it stand out from the crowd. One example is Infinity's activation system, where you get a pool of points equal to the number of fighters you have on your side each turn, but you can spend them in any way you want. Do you want to activate all of your fighters once? Go for it. Do you want to activate just one fighter 8 times instead? You can do that too, and any combination in between. So coming up with a completely distinctive activation system can be a great way to set your game apart. And even if you want to stick with a more traditional activation system for a game, coming up with new systems is still a fun design challenge, which I would recommend you give a go. So what are some fun ones we can think of? So let's quickly outline 3 new activation systems that we could use in a war game. The first one that comes to mind is one that incorporates bidding, so I'm going to call it bidding activations. Let's imagine at the start of each round, each player secretly bids a number. And to make this interesting, we'll say this is I go, you go, and the number a player bids equals the number of units they get to activate on their turn. But the player who bids the lower number gets to activate first. I said in my last video, I love the Sid Meier quote, "Games are a series of interesting choices." And this tries to put an interesting choice to the very heart of activating. And it does so by presenting a dilemma to the player. Acting first is in your interest, but so is acting with more units. So what number do you pick? To make sure that players don't always pick the same number, a system like this could work well using a deck of cards. We'll use standard playing cards for now. So rather than picking any number, they instead play a card. This would add unpredictability, but it could also further enhance the decision-making and design space. Let's say each player has a hand of 5 cards, and it isn't replenished until all cards are played. The player will need to try and guess the strategy of the other. That player usually plays their lowest card first, and last time they played a 4. Does this mean a 3 will beat them and guarantee me going first? Could I even get away with playing a 5? Introducing cards could also open up new design space. Are the cards used for other things too? Does each suit unlock a special type of action, such as hearts letting the units recuperate some damage, or clubs giving them a boost to melee as they club them over the head? You do see elements of this in Star Wars Legion, which is why it was one of the games I wanted to highlight. When you play order cards, each has a number of pips in the corner, and the card with the lowest number of pips gets to take the first activation. But I think it would be fun to see one where the bidding takes an even larger role. Alright, let's outline a second one. Some of these systems can seem quite gamey, and that doesn't appeal to every player. I said in my Inquisitor video that older simulation rules can have a real charm to them, and I have a lot of affection for them, even if they can be a pain to crunch and work out. So another approach is to gun for realism and have an activation system that takes the speed of a unit into account. This is the case with Inquisitor, where units activate in order of their speed value. It is also found in many role-playing games with their initiative order. Now, I certainly wouldn't recommend rolling for initiative across an entire army. That would be the very definition of a crunchy input, as it would take ages, and even individual speed characteristics across an entire army could be hard to track. Instead, I would think about putting all of units into a category. Think fast attack, troops, and heavy support of 3rd to 7th edition 40k, or something simpler such as a light, medium, and heavy category. So I'm going to call this system speed activations. Here, all the light units activate first, followed by the medium, and then the heavy. It could be I go, you go within those sub-rounds, or it could be alternate activation. It would bring some desired realism where to spring ambushes upon your opponent, you need to do so with lightly armoured units that are themselves vulnerable to counterattack. A third and final outline is a system I'm calling ramping activations, and it is inspired by what I said before when comparing the pacing of a card game like Magic the Gathering to a wargame like Warhammer 40,000. What could it look like if we built a wargame that ramped up like a card game? So the pace of an I go, you go wargame looks like this, or maybe like this. But the pacing of a card game like Magic actually looks like this, where rounds become more impactful and longer as time goes on. As mentioned before, this is achieved by the limit on land cards that can be played in Magic. In a similar game, Hearthstone, they removed the land system and achieved the same pacing by tying mana directly to the round. You get 1 mana on the first turn, 2 mana on the second turn, and so on until it caps at 10. You could make a system like this for a wargame. Let's call them command points instead of mana. So 1 command point on your first turn, 2 command points on your second turn, and so on. There would be no deployment, you just set up the battlefield and say go. And as the rounds progress, you receive a ramping amount of command points each turn, and those command points are spent both on bringing units to the battlefield and activating them. I'm going to use the Second World War as an example here, as I think it would fit this style of game. You can imagine one player spending their single command point in their first turn to parachute down a unit of paratroopers near an objective, and then on their second turn using their 2 command points to bring on a light tank from their board edge and to move those paratroopers into cover around that objective. Their opponent, on the other hand, sets up a single sniper in the clock tower on their first turn and then takes 2 shots on the paratroopers in their second. As turn 3 comes around, players need to start deciding how many points do they want to spend on the action playing out over the objective and how many points do they want to spend on reinforcing their line. One question would be, how do stronger and more dangerous units work? For example, a tiger tank. Maybe it costs more to bring to the battlefield, like a powerful creature in Magic, or maybe it can only arrive after a certain point, say from round 5 onwards. The next question would be, what happens once you reach 10 command points? Perhaps it caps out like in Hearthstone and you play these big powerful turns to defeat your opponent, or perhaps it resets back to 1 again. That would make for very interesting pacing that would look like this. 1 minute you're playing through these big sweeping turns with your opponent, the next minute you zoom right down into the action again, playing out the most critical scenes with your scant command points before the action starts to build back up again for a final climactic crescendo. This last one sounds kind of fun to me. Well, these are just a few ideas to get your brains cooking. So that brings us to the end of the video. It was quite a long one. I had to go and turn my light on a few moments ago because it was getting dark outside. But I hope that was a fun and informative look into activation systems in wargames. There are far more activation systems than just I go, you go and alternate activation. And as well as there being many already out there in existing games, there are also an infinite amount of activation systems that could be created for new games. Every activation system has a different feel and a different pace, and they all fall onto a spectrum. The closer to pure I go, you get, the more strategic your game feels. The closer to alternate activation you go, the more tactical it feels. If you do go for a system like I go, you go, however, you need to be aware of the problems its pacing can bring. Namely, the longer turns are and the more impactful they are, they can lead to these big punishing feedback loops, and they can lead to players becoming disinterested in the game. This is especially true in the earlier stages of the game and is incredibly crucial in the first turn of the game. So if you do want the strategic feel of I go, you go, you you need to think about how can you mitigate those pacing issues that it brings. One solution is to limit the effectiveness of units on the first turn, such as in classic Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Units simply are not in range to do much on the first turn, so the first turns play out relatively quickly. Another approach is to consider a hybrid system, such as the alternating detachments in Legions Imperialis, or the playthrough of the phase order like in Middle-earth strategy battle games, so that I move, you move, I shoot, you shoot, etc. I'd be curious to know what your favourite activation systems are, and if you think Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar need to change their activation system, and if yes, what should it change to? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll quickly say that if you're replying to a comment left by somebody else, please keep it civil and polite. You guys are awesome. In my last video, some of you left comments that the sound quality wasn't great, and that's something that I agree with. So I've upgraded my mic and I've done a little bit of studying on how to EQ my videos a little bit better. Thank you for your patience with this. I'm hoping that the sound quality will improve over time. Make sure you subscribe. We're getting close to 5,000 subscribers. Once we hit that milestone, I think I'll do an AMA to celebrate. So far, the videos that we've done, we've looked at a game that I worked on, which was Spearhead. We've done a deep dive into an older game and its mechanics, and that was Inquisitor. And now we've done this video, which was a more games design theory one focused on alternate activations. For the next video, I want to loop back round and talk about another game that I worked on, which was Warcry. Another video I have in the works is I want to do one on a design I'm not so proud of. So if you feel like roasting me, take a guess at what that might be down in the comments below. I'll give you a hint, it's not a standalone game, it's something inside Age of Sigmar. While I think there's a lot to learn from designs that went well, I think there's just as much, perhaps even more, to learn from designs that went wrong. And after grilling Gav Thorpe's design of Inquisitor so much in the last video, I felt like I should apply that own scrutiny to my own designs as well. So look forward to that video and let me know what other videos you would like to see from the channel down in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, bye for now.